Okay, and now we are back. So after the break, welcome. And I'm together with Dan Wahlin, who is cloud developer advocate at Microsoft. And Dan today will uh, tell for us a few secrets about Microsoft Graph and how to implement in our organization. As always, you can post a question to Dan on our chat, and at the end we'll have short Q&A session. So Dan, the stage is yours.
All right. Well, thanks. Well, I'm really excited to be here. One of these days, I got to get to Warsaw in person, but maybe next year. Who knows? But yeah, as mentioned, my name is Dan Wahlin, and I spend my time mostly working with Microsoft Cloud integrations. And by that, I mean doing things between Azure, Microsoft 365, which we're going to focus on, and Power Platform. So, what we're going to talk about today is how we can actually integrate organizational data, which I'll clarify what I mean by that, into our different applications. Now, I'm going to focus on ASP.NET Core and C Sharp and things, but keep in mind, it's not just about that. It can be done with anything. If you're using Python or just pure JavaScript or something else, that would be totally fine with this. So before we start, let me clarify what I mean by organizational data in Microsoft Graph. So Microsoft Graph is a technology that allows you to get to a lot of different resources that we at work would use every day. So we're talking about files, emails, chats, calendar events, and on and on and on. There's much more than that as well. So with Microsoft Graph, it is a set of RESTful APIs that you can actually call from your applications in a very secure way, I might add. We'll talk about that. And in doing so, you can bring this type of data into a user's app. And I'll explain why you might want to do that as we move along here. So let's jump right in. Let's say that you're working on, a sales type of internal app that's custom, because there's not enough sales apps out there, right? And the customer you're working with, you've created files, you have lots of emails, there's different people in the organization that would need to interact with that customer, or that maybe you go to for advice on a contract or a product that's being sold or whatever it may be. And then, of course, you have meetings and notes and all these other things. Well, I think as a developer, and I could speak just for myself here, I'm used to focusing on just, I have an app, I have APIs, I have a database or a data store of some type, and that's what I focus on. And that is normally a good thing, but there's all this other related data that might be helpful to the salesperson in this case that we could bring into the app. Now, why would you want to do that? Well, how many times do you jump to Outlook or your email client, or jump to OneDrive or Dropbox or whatever you're using for file storage, and try to find something that relates to the problem you're trying to solve? Maybe you're just filling out a form and there's some data you need that you received an email. Well, what if we could actually bring that data into the app and make it context sensitive? So, if I'm working with a Datum corporation as an example, then I could just bring that right in. Now, I'm going to jump real quick before we move on over to the some apps I'm going to show you. This is the one we're going to look at, and you'll notice right up top we have email, calendar, and files. We're going to focus mostly on the email and calendar side today, just because I only have about 30 minutes. But here's kind of another app that's not out there yet, but it will be hopefully by next week, hopefully by Microsoft Build. You'll notice down here at the bottom, I have these tabs. So these are files that are related to this customer I clicked on, or Teams chats I was doing. And I could even start a new Teams chat from here if I wanted. Here's some emails, and I could go read those, or here's some calendar events I've had with that company. And these are the type of things you can bring right into the app so that your users aren't having to jump out and go somewhere else all the time. So that's kind of what we're going to talk about. That sets the stage for this organizational data that I referred to. Now, for some of you, you're probably going, what is Microsoft Graph? Well, the way it works is it's a set of RESTful APIs, as I mentioned earlier. So let's say that you have this salesperson app. Well, in order to call these RESTful APIs, just like anything out there, of course, we need security. So we can use Microsoft Identity for that. Behind the scenes, this would use Azure Active Directory. And then we can then get a token, which we're going to talk about in a moment, that would have permissions that would allow us to get into things like that user's email. Now, when I say that user's email, I'm not talking about me getting that user's email. I'm talking about them getting access to their own email. I would get access to mine. You would get access to yours. There is a way to apply application level permissions where you could pull from different people. That takes way more permissions though. We're talking about just at the user level, letting them get to their own stuff, in other words. Now, the way this would work then is you'll add a little bit of code in the middleware for your ASP.NET Core app. We're going to look at that in just a moment. The user logs in, they get this token. The token has different permissions, like they can read files. They could read emails. They could send or read Teams chats, those types of things. And then we would make these RESTful API calls. All right, so what's nice about this is not only can you get to files and emails and chats and things like that, but there's way more. It's literally a graph of data, and you can hook into all kinds of things, not just the things I'm going to talk about today. All right, so there's really 5 main steps to get started with this. First off, you need to know where the docs are. All right, that's simple. You can go to aka.ms/m-graph, as you see here, and that'll get you right to the docs. Now, you can also start to learn about what's possible and practice by using something called Graph Explorer. This is one URL. I even have a shorter one, which is GE. You can just say aka.ms/GE. We're going to look at that in just a moment. And then, of course, you need the tools. Well, in this case, we're going to be using C# and ASP.NET Core. But again, if you're doing TypeScript or you're doing Python or something else, that's totally fine. It's just a RESTful API. You are going to need to configure an app in Azure Active Directory. I'm not going to show that today, but it literally takes, 30 to 60 seconds to do that. It's very straightforward. And then you need to consume these RESTful APIs. So before we go too far, let me run a demo here. And this is the shorter version of the URL, GE. And this is an online tool that you can use called Graph Explorer. And I'll have to admit, I use this every day. I'm actually working on an internal project right now at Microsoft. And I just used this to send some information to another product team for something I'm trying to do, and I couldn't do it. So I'm like, hey, what do I do? And then we're going to work that out. So one of the things you'll want to do with Microsoft Graph is typically once a user's logged in, you might want to pull their user profile. You want to get, their first and last name, maybe their email address, things like that. So the way we can do that is through this type of query here. Notice graph.microsoft.com v10, which is currently the most current version. Me represents the logged in user. Now, you'll notice I'm already logged in over here. When you go to this site, which again, you can go to aka.ms/GE. If you go there, you'll be at the same site. You won't be logged in, but you could set up a free Microsoft 365 tenant. Let me actually go into like docs. It'll have information about that if you're interested. You can sign up for this free tenant, and you can do all kinds of stuff. So if you literally want to play with in a development environment, having your own email, your own OneDrive for Business, you even get SharePoint, things like that if you do SharePoint development. But you can get all that for free, and that's what I'm using right now as a free version. So if I do me and hit run query, this is what you'll see. We're going to actually have this JSON data. Now, this is all fake because I'm in my developer tenant. But notice I have my display name, my given name, my mail, which is a fake email, things like that. And that's just the start of it. Now, I could also come in and you could get like the user's image if you wanted, like this image right here. That's also possible to get. And you could do way more. Now, look over here on the left. So like if I want the image, you'd say me/photo $value. Now, what $value adds, if I do just this and do the photo, notice it gives me back just information about the photo. But if I actually want to get the raw base64 encoded version that I want to embed in my app, I can say $value, and then it brings back, yeah, that ugly guy there. So we don't want to see that guy too much. But let's go to my mail. Okay, well, it'd be me/messages. Okay, let's hit run query. And again, this is going to be all fake email data, but notice that I can get to things like the body preview. I can come on in and get, has it been read? Is it a draft? All these fun types of things. And then there's the content of the body right there. So it's all the HTML and things like that that are in that. And the list goes on and on and on. In fact, if I scroll down on the left side here, you're going to notice that there's just all kinds. You can integrate with Excel. You can integrate with OneNote. I mentioned OneDrive. All these types of things can be done with Microsoft Graph. So having shown you that, let's move along here. And let's talk about, so what if I wanted to get like someone's email, just as an example, like what would that process look like? So when they log in the app, they maybe type a customer name or they type some subject that they're looking for. What if I could write code to say, well, let me go find emails that are related to that particular thing you typed? Pretty easy to do, actually. So whether it's email, chats, files, events, devices, even security information, you can get to the to-do tasks even. And again, there's like hundreds of things you can get to. We can do that very easily with the following process. Now, first off, we're going to have to get this access token. So we're going to need to authenticate the user, of course. We're going to use Microsoft Identity for that. And we're going to get this access token I mentioned earlier. Now, that will be used and will have the proper permissions in it to actually call and get that user's email. Now, you're not going to be able to get my email or your email. It would only be that user's email. It's very secure that way. And that's what we would want, of course. So there is an entire walkthrough, and I'll give you a link here at the end. I'm not going to spend time on it right now, that will walk you through this exact code that I'm going to show you. So if you want to do that, I'll give you this link again at the end, and you can just take a picture if you want. But let me walk you through the general process I'm going to show you in code. So the first thing is you need an app. Now, we're going to do a .NET, ASP.NET Core C# type app, but again, you can do whatever you'd like there. We then need to register that app in Azure Active Directory. So you go to the Azure portal, or you could use the Azure CLI. And literally in, like I said, 30, maybe 60 seconds, you can actually go through and register this app you're building with Azure Active Directory. Now, that's going to give you some information. I'll talk about that in a moment, like a client ID and a tenant ID that you would need to embed in your app. We'll get to that in a moment. Then you're going to add some middleware. Now, if you're doing .NET Core, or you're doing Node.js, you're pretty used to middleware. It's a very common thing these days. And we would need this to first off authenticate the user, but also say what permissions do we want this user to be associated with that token. So for example, do we want them to allow the app to get their email? Do we want them to be able to get their Teams chats or files or whatever it may be? So I'll show you the middleware. That'd be one of the first things we actually look at. Okay, from there, we're going to create a Graph email client. This is some code we're going to write. And we're going to use that to call the RESTful APIs. Now, I mentioned this is a RESTful API, but there are software developer kits, SDKs, that you can use. I'm going to be using one of those here. Yes, you could write the raw HTTP requests, or you could just use the SDK. The SDK greatly simplifies, as you'll see in a moment. And then, of course, once we get the data back, we would render those emails. So, all right, you're probably going, all right, show me the code, Dan. Well, let's do that. So if we jump on over, this is the app. And you'll notice right now, first off, I already have it running. So you'll see .NET Run. It's running locally right now. And you'll see that I said, welcome, Dan. And then up here, I'm already logged in. I did that mainly to save time. You'll also notice, I'm not going to have time to talk about it, but notice this kind of green circle around me right now. That's my presence indicator. Now, it might not actually be green. Yeah, see, it's red. And that's because I also have Microsoft Teams just loaded in the browser here. And if I come on in and refresh this and made myself available up here, so I could, instead of busy, I could say, I'm available. Then what will happen is that's my presence. Like, am I available? Am I busy? Am I in a meeting? What do you got going on? Well, let's refresh this, and it probably, yeah, there we go. Now I'm back to green. So that's also a Microsoft Graph call where you can say, what's the user's presence right now? So you could even integrate that in your app, but that's not what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about this. How could I get to the user's email? So you'll notice these are some fake ones I put in. And then these are some other emails that are just kind of sent behind the scenes with my Microsoft 365 developer tenant. So the way this would work is through the following. So I have an app here, and you'll have access to all this code if you're interested. But let me open up the CS Proj, and you're going to notice a couple: Microsoft Identity Web, Web UI, and Microsoft Graph. Now, what these are some NuGet packages. If you do .NET, you're very familiar with this, that we can add into our projects so that now I can come in and do things like add middleware. Now, let me go ahead and hide the console here. So first off, if you're doing .NET Core at all, you'll know about our startup file. This is, if you're not familiar with it, this is where we can add things like middleware. And think of middleware like subway stops, where as we're going along, I want to first authenticate the user. That's subway stop 1. Maybe subway stop 2 is I want to do some logging that I authenticated the user, and then it keeps going. And that's the request that's coming into the server. It hits this middleware, kind of like subway stops. Well, what I'm doing is first off, going to be adding some middleware to say, hey, I need to authenticate the user. I need to add Microsoft Identity functionality. I need to enable token acquisition that can then be used to call Microsoft Graph. Microsoft Graph would be a downstream API. And then I want to add Microsoft Graph functionality to actually make the calls. And so we'll see that. Now, I mentioned earlier that you have to register your apps with Azure Active Directory, and you also have to say what permissions you want. Now, the Azure Active Directory stuff I currently have in my ASP.NET Core secrets. Okay, so I won't run you through that, but if you're not familiar with secrets, there's just a way to store data outside of the code on your local machine so that when you check in your code, you don't accidentally put these secrets into your code. All right, so that's where my Azure Active Directory client ID and tenant ID is in this secret right now. But what I want to call your attention to is this. Notice this base URL. Now that should look familiar because if we go back to Microsoft Graph Explorer, same base URL, okay? And then notice these scopes. Now, if you're not familiar with scopes, think of them like permissions. I would like this app to be able to read the user profile, that's the me, the user presence, mailbox settings read. I'm only doing that because I'm getting to their time zone. That's what that gets me access to. I can read their email, read their calendar, and then I'm not going to have time to go into files today, but I can also read and write files. That's part of this app as well. Now, what will happen is when the user first logs in, they're going to have to give consent to say that, yeah, it's okay to do these things. And if they don't consent, then your app won't have access. So you'll have to plan for that, of course. But once we have registered the app with Azure Active Directory and then come in, and really this is kind of a copy paste exercise, to be honest. You don't need to memorize this. You'll have access to this code and you can get started very easily with it. But once we have that up and in place, let's go into the really cool stuff here. So I'm going to go into the Graph email client, and you're going to notice a constructor here. Let me move that sidebar. So I'm going to inject a logger. Okay, that's just a bonus, but this is what I really want. Notice this Graph service client. This is part of the Microsoft Graph SDK. You'll see Microsoft Graph right up top as a namespace, and this is included in the C# SDK. This makes it so that I can call APIs and get emails, get profile, get files, things like that without writing a ton of code. So here's an example. If I want to get the user's email messages, then I can say, hey, all right, Graph client, that's what you saw injected, go to the me and get the messages. Now, again, if we go back to Microsoft Graph, that's exactly this call I showed you earlier. It's just that it's kind of hiding that functionality from us. Okay, so if we come on in, notice we're going to make a request to me/messages, ultimately. I only want to select, though, the subject, the body preview, and the receive date time. Now, notice there's a lot more you can get. Look at the value here. All right, I can get the created date time, last modified, change key, categories. Well, I don't want all these JSON properties. In this case, I only want these three: subject, body preview, receive date. I want to order by the receive date, descending order. So that way it sorts by the date. And I only want to grab 10 of those. So select the top 10 for you database folks out there is really what we're doing. And then this is an async call. So what that will do is that will automatically make the call to Microsoft Graph. We've already authenticated. We have the token. We have the rights, the permissions to get messages. And then that assigns it to emails and returns it. Now, from there, we need to render them. And that's just in a page here. So what I'm going to do in there is just loop through the messages we got back. Well, actually, here's the loop right here. And then I'm going to write out the subject, the receive date, the body preview. Same thing as I just showed you if we go back here. So what's really nice about this is you generally would write this once. If you're on a team and you realize that, hey, we could use this functionality in a lot of apps, then typically you're just going to make your own library that has this functionality, import that library into your different apps, and now all you'd have to do is handle rendering it however you want to render that data for that app. Now, obviously, that's just for email. There's more we could do, though. So what about doing something like calendar events? Well, let's go back to the app real quick. And you'll see that I also have calendar events here. And notice I have this MS Tech Summit, a Tech Summit talk. I guess I probably should show up for this. Now, all I did for that is I literally this morning added this, but let me just add one more here. And let's just put, test. Well, let me highlight it, test event, and save that. And there we go. Now let's go back to here. Let's refresh. And now there we go. There's test event now being pulled into my app. So again, what's cool about this is I'm just pulling in all the events within a certain time frame. But if you know this is for a company or this is for a project or whatever it is, you can also add filters to this. So you don't have to just grab everything. Not only can you sort and grab specific fields, but you can also do kind of like where clauses, if you will, kind of like you do in a database. So let me walk you through this. You're going to see it's very, very similar. So, in this case, we're not going to do email. We're going to do events. And it's going to be the same process. We're going to have to authenticate the user. We get an access token, but this time we need the calendar permissions, the calendar scopes. And that would allow us to then call into calendar events. So again, there's a walkthrough on this if you're interested in seeing this step by step. So I'll give you another link here, be this link at the bottom. But we're going to do the same thing as you just saw. We're going to have the app. We're going to register that app in Azure Active Directory, in this case, just once. Add that middleware you already saw. And then now we're going to use a custom graph calendar client, which I'll show you in a moment, to actually call the API and then render the calendar events. Okay. So if we jump on back, you've already seen the middleware part, right? We've already added the authentication, the identity, and the token acquisition. You've also already seen the scopes or permissions this app needs. Now, one of those is calendars.read. Okay, I already showed you mail.read. We just did that. Now we're going to do calendars.read. All right. Now it's going to be the same story as you saw earlier. Notice if I go to this graph calendar client, which is a custom class I wrote, I'm going to inject, let's get rid of the sidebar again, the graph service client. Where's that come from? That's part of the C# SDK for .NET Core. Didn't have to write any of that. I just had to inject it. So we're going to capture that in a field called graph service client. And look at this, get events. Okay. Now there's a little more to this one because I am getting time zones. You know, for me, it's about 7:50 in the morning right now. For you, most of you, it's the end of the afternoon, getting into the evening, right? So let me know, by the way, how's the future look? I'm not there yet. You're ahead of me. So give me any stock tips. I wish. Anyway, poor humor. I got to inject it. Sorry. It's just me. So what we're going to do is a little logging. We're going to log the user time zone. All right. Then what I'm going to do is say, hey, I don't want to just grab all calendar events. I want to get from the start of the week to the end of the week. So I want the next 7 days of calendar events. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create some view options. Now, what this view options object is, it's really a set of query, kind of like where clauses. What I'm going to do is say, hey, make sure that the start date time and the end date time is in this range that I just captured right there. So in other words, just grab the next week's worth of calendar events. All right. Now, the next thing we're going to do is use that injected client, all right, to say, all right, let's go to me calendar view. Now, before I move on, let's go back to Microsoft Graph Explorer and let's just search for like calendar here. My events for the next week. Hey, that looks familiar because that's what we're doing. And look what we're doing here. Calendar view, start date time, end date time, same thing we're doing right now. Run the query. This would get me the calendar events that we have. And there's all that JSON you can get to if you want to. We could also come into here. I should mention that you saw earlier, like take the top 10, or I want to filter based on a keyword, or I want to order by. Well, these are query parameters, they're called, that I can actually add. So for instance, I could say order by, and then look down here, created date time. That's probably not a good thing to order by, but we could do something like that. Now in code, the way that would look is the following. I would like to call the graph service client, get to me/calendar view. And then for this request, I want to send in these query options. Okay, so I want to send in the start date and the end date, so we get the next week. I am setting a header here for the user's time zone because I want to be sensitive to the time zone, of course. But look what I'm selecting back. Okay, I don't want all those JSON properties. I just want these 4. Now, again, this is no different than, most of you probably work with a database. And when you do a select, you oftentimes don't do select star. You do select, field 1, field 2, field 3 from table, or you call your store procedure that does that. That's exactly what we're doing here. We're trying to minimize the amount of traffic over the wire, because if my app only needs these 4 things, then only grab the 4 things. Makes sense, right? We're going to order by the start date time, and then we're going to say, all right, let's go get it. Now, this little call here to get events, again, I have a razor page over here called email, and all we're going to do is loop through those messages. And we're not doing email, we're doing calendar. Let me go to calendar. It's going to be the same thing though. We're going to loop through the events is what I meant to show. And then I'm just going to write out that subject. I'm doing a little bit of formatting on the time zone just to make sure that it doesn't show up like my time when it's your time in Warsaw, if that's where you're at right now, or elsewhere. And then here's my end time. I start my end time. So all this data right here that I'm returning, I can then write that out if I want. In this case, I'm just writing out some of these, like the subject is the main one, you'll notice. All right, so there's a lot more we could talk about. Like there's a files example in here, how you could actually retrieve files, how you can upload files. In fact, I'll just show you real quickly the example to wrap up. We go to files. I have some very important files here, like a bacon survey, if you like bacon, a trending doc. But I could also come in, choose a doc from my local machine, and then I could actually upload that through the app. And that would upload it to OneDrive for Business. And all of this, again, is using Microsoft 365, a developer tenant, but obviously for production, you would use your real one. So there's just a ton of functionality. Like I showed in this other app, you could make it where, like if they're working with a data grid and they click view related content, this now goes out and finds the files, any chats. Looks like I don't have much for them. Let me go to like Tailwind Traders. So I think I have a little bit more sample data. You know, I have like 6 Teams chats I could go to. I have some calendar events. And now I'm using, you know, the filtering. I'm only grabbing the fields I want, all that type of functionality to grab this data. So I hope this gives you an idea about what's possible with Microsoft Graph. Personally, I think it's a great opportunity. I know I work for Microsoft, so you're probably going, yeah, Dan, you're going to say this either way. But honestly, if I didn't have a lot of experience building business apps before I came to Microsoft, I probably wouldn't say this, but I do. I did for 20 years. I ran a consulting company, and this is just such a great way to add to the user's productivity by not making them jump to all these other apps. Just bring the data where they work every day. And that's kind of what we're talking about here. So I have a bunch of links. I just want to call out a few of these for you. This Graph Docs, M-Graph, I showed this earlier. That'd be one of them. There's some tutorials. Here's that Graph Explorer. This is absolutely, in my opinion anyway, the best way to get started with this, because, you know, for me, I don't have all those APIs. If we go back to this real quick here, I don't have all these memorized. I mean, I know a lot of them, but most of these I don't have memorized. I have to go look it up. In fact, you'll notice these little icons right here. This will actually take you to the docs for that API right here, which is super helpful. I literally just used this yesterday, as I mentioned, because I need to figure something out with another product group internally. So this is the best way to start. Figure out what's possible. Then you can use these types of apps. We have this available for you. We have a JavaScript version. There's others that you can now learn how to do this in your apps. Now, the learning path that I want to highlight is this one right here, MSGraph.NET Core Scenario. So I don't know if you have your phone, if you just take a picture of this, you'd have it. But this is the one that would show you the app I was just demonstrating. All right, this is one I actually built to put out there. And then if you say, well, Dan, we're not really doing C#, we're doing, you know, Node.js or JavaScript, then we have a JavaScript scenarios one. If you're doing Python, our team didn't create that, but I know Microsoft Graph has samples for Python and other languages. So definitely check those out if you're interested. And with that, let me turn it back over here because I think we got about 3 minutes left and see if we have any questions. And I appreciate everybody tuning in and listening to me today. So, all right. So how are we doing? Any questions come in?
Okay, Dan, thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. I look at our chat and it's empty. So the presentation was so self-explanatory that nobody can, and that no one have any question to your presentation. So thank you very much.
Thing, huh? All right.
That's right. It was so simple and so clearly explained. So thank you very much once again, and thank you very much for all of you for participating in this session. And as always, you can rate Dan's presentation, so use stars under the video to rate presentation. Thank you very much, and see you after a break.